Well, good morning. This is Catherine Schneider from the Fitchburg Historical Society. And this morning we're continuing our interviews with Tom Hovel, who spent many years as city planner for the city of Fitchburg. This is our third and final interview with Tom. So we're just so happy that he has been willing to do this series of interviews with us. And just to recap about Fitchburg moved from a township into being a city in 1983. And then Tom came aboard as city planner in 1986 and continued in that position until 2018. So tenure of 32 years. So major part of his career was spent in the city of Fitchburg as a planner. So good morning, Tom. Good to see you this morning. So today we are going to be focusing on the implementation of plans, the planning for the city of Fitchburg. So Tom, I think first question to ask you is what were the main implementation tools that were used to carry forward the city's vision and plan?
Okay. Let me thank you, Catherine. So the main implementation tools to implement the plan are ordinances, and I'm going to concentrate on 3 ordinances. There are others, but they tend to, like stormwater management and things like that, but they don't tend to affect land use as much or the built environment other than seeing storm ponds. So in the prior 2 episodes, we discussed planning in Fitchburg, and plans are implemented through the ordinances. So the 3 main ordinances I want to touch on. The first is the zoning code. Second is the land division ordinance. And then third is the architectural review ordinance. And then all 3 of these codes were in effect actually by Fitchburg when it was a town. And so for example, in 1974, I think it was, the town adopted the land division code, but it really didn't regulate land division like saying, like streets and things like that. It was really put in place for park purposes, because if you recall, a lot of the city's main big apartment projects were built in that late 60s, early 70s. And the city, I think, or the town then realized, hey, we're not, we're the parks for these people. And there was always been kind of that dearth of parkland up in that northern part of the city. And so they put in the land division ordinance, and the first one of the main requirements was park dedication. And that was at 2,900 square feet per dwelling unit that was constructed. And so that was interesting how the land division ordinance came about. Then a few years later, it started to get more meat on the bones, regulating land division to a greater extent that we see today. But anyway, so zoning regulates the use of land, what can and cannot be accomplished on each parcel. And each standard zoning district has permitted uses and conditional uses. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Permitted uses are allowed by right. You can do them, obviously subject to the zoning code has certain what we call dimensional or bulk standards. So you have setbacks, building height, things like that. Conditional uses go through another level of review. They go to the Plan Commission, and there's a public hearing that's held, and then there's a set of criteria within the code that the Plan Commission weighs each conditional use that it's acting on against to see whether it meets the standards and should be approved. And then they can also place certain conditions on that use. So conditional use, because you can place conditions to help mitigate what the Plan Commission may perceive as some impacts that might be related to traffic or building design, layout, occupancy, how many, what the set a cap on occupancy or something like that. So the third code is the architectural review ordinance. And that looks at site and building design. So that gets more down to a little more detail. And there's not a lot of standards for it, but it was put in place to, get into things like landscaping, driveways, parking layout, and the building design as well. So let's take an example back to the zoning code. The RL district is a standard single family residential district. And that single family is pretty much the main permitted use. Schools and say churches or religious institutions are some of the conditional uses that are allowed. And so they would have to, church or school would have to go through more review than what a single family home does. Single family home is pretty much reviewed at the local level. The land division code regulates the division of property where a parcel is divided into lots. And so there's two types of land divisions. One is the certified survey map, and that can be done for if you're creating 4 or less parcels within a 5-year period, you can do a certified survey map. That's one step. It's a simpler process and less expensive for the applicant because it's not as detailed in terms of requirements as is a plat. So the surveying and things like that is less expensive. Then the other is the land is the subdivision or the plat. And that's a 2-step process, typically with a preliminary plat and the final plat. But actually in much of Fitchburg, there's also a third step, an earlier step, which is called the conditional or the comprehensive development plan. And so it takes that whole property and lays out a comprehensive development plan. I don't remember what the size requirement was. But you lay that out so that you then have all your land divisions kind of following that comprehensive development plan. So it gives it bigger overlook as to what the whole project will look like before you even start platting the property. Then the architectural review of site design I kind of touched on, and that's to encourage better site and design review within the community. And I think, I don't know when that came into effect, but I'm suspecting it probably came after some of those large apartment projects too. Now, that's a review, the architectural review. There's also a design review under the zoning code, so we kind of combine them together. That's a review by the Plan Commission typically. Well, during my tenure, we kind of made some minor projects available to be reviewed by the zoning administrator or the city planner position. And then they could be appealed to the Plan Commission if that was, for example, denied. But the main intent of that, as I said, was to enhance the design and architectural review of sites. And so Fitchburg had that, as I mentioned, before we became a city, which I thought was kind of interesting. So they were looking ahead. You have to give a lot of credit to the town folk in the 70s, the leaders who put a lot of these ordinances into effect. That kind of gets to the other thing is Fitchburg was under the Dane County zoning code until 1983 when we incorporated in April. So there's a lot of activity that started happening within a few-year period. And so what Fitchburg did is it adopted the Dane County zoning ordinance as its interim zoning code. So everything would pretty much stay the same in terms of zoning. The administration changed. So all of a sudden you went from Dane County administering the zoning to the city. And so Bill Stoneman, who was the assessor, had to take on the extra role as the zoning administrator at the time. And then they started bringing out some more professional help in terms of the Dane County Regional Planning Commission as consultants and stuff like that to assist. And then I was hired in 1986 as the first full-time zoning administrator and city planner. So one of my first main jobs was to help see through the creation and the adoption of a Fitchburg zoning code. And so much of the standard zoning code that we see today is from that effort that occurred back in 1986. And I think the code was adopted in early 87. I think it was March of 87, the code was adopted. So it's a different code from the county code. Okay, and I want to touch on a few main differences here. Dane County has what's called a pyramidal zoning code. So typically the most restrictive district is, say, a single family district. And then you get to you get to the, say, 2-family district, a multifamily district, you get the various business districts. Well, each in a pyramidal zoning code, everything allowed in the residential is allowed in the next level of the more dense residential, and it keeps going. So pretty much everything that's allowed in residential single family zoning in Dane County code was also allowed in the industrial district. And that just didn't make sense because it leads to potential incompatibility of uses, and you should be protecting your industrial base as well from concerns and people locating next and then complaining about industrial uses. Well, they need to be protected too, because they provide tax-based employment and other things to the community. I mean, we have TIF districts in order to encourage industrial development. So it was kind of a disconnect there in terms of land use and zoning. So when we created the Fitchburg Code, we went away from that pyramidal zoning. So another thing I want to touch on is Fitchburg by that time in 86, 87 already had a lot of large multifamily projects. And the city did not want to see those large, they were built under Dane County zoning, what was called its R4, its multifamily district. And the city did not want to see those be put into non-conformance because as we were creating our new code, we created a new RH district, residential high density. We used letters instead of a letter and a number. Had less density requirements than what the R4 district had. But in order to avoid putting them into a state of non-conformance, which we didn't want to do because that would limit how much you can improve the buildings, and my goodness, that's the last thing you want to do with multifamily, is we created what we called an RHA district. And that was the same as the R4 district. Standards are exactly the same. You just basically cut and pasted them. Basically, the code just referenced the R4 zoning of Dane County. So we had to always keep that old Dane County ordinance handy, not just for that, but for other uses that were maybe allowed. You could go back and check the history. But the interesting thing is that we did not allow any more land to be zoned to that RHA. Whatever land was zoned R4 became known as RHA, and it stuck as that designation. But we wouldn't allow any new land to be zoned that way. So instead, if you want to do a higher density development, more like what you could be done under R4 in the city, you had to move to what we call the planned development district. And that's a two-step process. There's a general implementation plan and a specific implementation plan. So it's kind of like the planning process. If you look at it, you go from a more general where they lay out basics, and then you go to the more specific. So it can be timed differently too. You can have a general implementation plan approved, and then a year or two later, a couple months later, you put in one specific implementation plan, and then even later, several months down the road, you can put in another specific for part of it. So because realizing you're not doing the whole development all at one point in time. So that's how they got around, and that planned development district then put that higher level of review on the multifamily projects. And I think it was because the city understood that there were problems already starting with some of the large projects in the north, and that better design through more intense review could help mitigate those or the impacts of some of the multifamily housing. As the multifamily houses, we kind of created some unwritten policy, so to speak. So for one of the things is for PDD to make it more beneficial, we're tending to require, didn't always happen, but we would try to obtain one parking stall under the building in the basement for at least one of the two required parking stalls. And the idea behind that was to put more of the green space on the surface and not have just all massive parking. And I think that's one of the things you see with some of the larger projects in the northern part of, the thing that strikes you sometimes is not just the mass of the building, but all of the parking. So you certainly have large buildings, but that's a way to compensate for the economics of getting that underground parking stall. So the PDD is more flexible to a degree because you're basically creating your own zoning district for each project. But the problem with that is it's expensive and very time consuming. And anytime you want to change it, you typically have to almost go back to step one, and you may have to amend your GIP, general implementation plan, and then do your next specific implementation plan. So we were trying to come up with a better way, knowing that we were moving through our plans to this kind of mixed use type of development and a diversity of uses. We did, following the comprehensive plan adoption in 2009, we followed that up with rewriting both the zoning code and the land division code. And we took those codes and we made them more compatible with the comprehensive plan so that you can implement the policies and directives of the comprehensive plan. But we also did something different. We adopted smart code zoning. And that's a neo-traditional zoning code. And we're the only city in the state to use the smart code zoning as our neo-traditional zoning code. A lot of communities kind of created their own. But the smart code's a rather unique type of thing because it gives quite a bit of flexibility actually to the developer, because the way it's constructed, it gives them flexibility. You kind of set fences or borders and they can do stuff within those fences or borders, so to speak, as they see fit. And so it's kind of libertarian to a degree. You're setting up some standards, but then they have room within those standards. And we were fortunate that Avante Properties saw the benefit of smart code zoning. And I don't know that it would have been, if they hadn't come to support it, I don't know that it would ever have been adopted as an option within the city, because it's basically a new type of thing. It's a new way of thinking about zoning and development. And so that Nine Springs area at the corner of, east of Sain Road and north of Lacey, where the new interchange is, that's all smart code zoning. So basically the neo-traditional zoning, which this code looks to do, looks back in time to when downtowns and communities that were developed pre-auto age. So what do you see when you look at those communities? You see buildings, particularly downtown. The buildings are closer to the street. Same thing with a lot of the residential. You might see some alleys. The streets are narrower. And so it's kind of that traditional downtown feel that we still look to. When you're watching Christmas shows right about this time, movies and stuff, they always show downtowns. It's always that new traditional downtown. They never really show much of a big box type of development. Almost all the action takes place, if they're in a commercial area, in one of those traditional downtowns. So that shows how in our mindset, we still have likened back to that traditional feature of downtowns. So smart code zoning sets up parameters and combines aspects of certain aspects of zoning, land division, and architectural and design review. And with this mixed type of zoning, they have what are called T-zones. And so T-zones are different intensities of land use. So we have T3, T4, and T5 in Fitchburg, which the higher the number, the more intensity. So T3 would be more comparable to single family. T4 is a combination of single family and lower density multifamily with some commercial. And then T5 tends to be higher density multifamily and commercial. And then there's also a special district for industrial development and some larger things such as that. So the developers then can adjust their development we set certain parameters that each T-zone has to be a certain range within your overall development, percent of the land use. And so they can adjust their T-zone. So the nice thing about that, for example, is that if they see the market changing. So for example, there's a downturn because of interest rate increases in single family, but you're seeing an increase in multifamily, or what we call the missing middle. This kind of middle range of housing that you used to see built, but people tend to build either single family or large apartments. Or that you could go to that missing middle and put in some more T4 and take away some of your T3 if you have that capability. Or if the market flips the other way, you could take some of your T4 and put it to T3. So more of the single family. So they can adjust those markets, because when you're planting 200, 300 acres, it's not all going to be developed within 1 or 2 years. It's going to take several years for that development to occur. So And then within that time, economics can switch rather dramatically. With the bulk or dimensional requirements of standard zoning, that sets certain minimum requirements. So you have a minimum lot size and you have minimum setbacks from the street. Smart code does it differently. It doesn't really set forth a lot size, and rather it sets what's called a block perimeter. And the block perimeter is a maximum, around your block. And that's created in order to help with make the subdivision or the development more walkable, to avoid really long blocks. And they also have basically just a lot width requirement. So there's no lot. So basing the lot width with the block perimeter, you get to a kind of a lot size. They don't care how big your lot gets. They care more about how it works at the width front, because what they do is they regulate, try to get a good sense of build out at the street. So they have minimum and maximum levels of build out for the street, so that what we call having a sense of enclosure. And so the higher the T-zone you move, the more build out you required for your front width. So in T5, you see much more higher level of build out of the street. T3, you see less, and T4 is in the middle in between the two. So that's a way to form that sense of enclosure, which studies show help walkability, because people feel more safe when they have kind of a sense of enclosure. And it's, I think, harkens back to, like I said, when you watch those Christmas specials on television, there are always those traditional downtowns, and you see the activity and the vibrancy. Of course, it's a television show, but that's intended, what the smart code zoning is intended to create. So it's intended to create that vibrant neighborhood with mixed use and walkability, to reduce the reliance on automobiles. You do that through mixed use. So allowing people to be able to walk to a store, or walk down to get a pizza, or to the tavern or something like that, and then walk back, take drunk drivers off the road. It was kind of interesting when we were talking about this, when we were creating it. We had one of our assistant fire chiefs who was in to talk about it. He picked up on right away. He grew up in Detroit, and he said, "You mean I could maybe walk down to the tavern like I did when I lived in Detroit?" Well, yeah, that's kind of the idea. And the smart code wants what they call these third places, these places where people can meet and congregate. So the other thing we tried to do is with biking, and Fitchburg adopted what's called a bicycle module into our smart code. So when you're driving down part of Lacey and East Sherrill in that Nine Springs development, east of Sain Road, you see this kind of green concrete pavement along the road edge. That's what's called a cycle track. So what we did is we're probably one of the few places in the state to use a cycle track, maybe even the first. It puts the bikes up off the road on the busier streets. You don't want to necessarily be bicycling on a busy street, but the bikes still go the same direction as traffic. So you got street, you got the parking area on the street, and then you're up above the curb with your cycle track, and then you have a little bit of buffer, and then you have your sidewalk for people. So it's a really interesting creation, that whole cycle track. But I think it should work well, and keep bicyclists off the street where the heavier traffic is. Certainly not all streets need that, because some bicyclists can work very well, but when you've got that higher traffic street like Lacey is, that certainly helps play a role. So they talked about the market-friendly nature of how it can adjust to be more market-friendly with the smart code. And so it's overall, it leads to a diversity of land use in the socioeconomic standpoint, but that also can lead to diversity in other things too. Besides, it can lead to diversity in other identifiers and groups. And so that's the whole strength of that code. Finally, on the smart code, the parks are smaller, but they tend to be more integrated within the development. And that way it allows for better interaction among the visitors and residents that may be there. So that kind of gives a primer on the zoning from the zoning standpoint.
Tom, it strikes me that the zoning has evolved. There is the sense of how that changes over time, how people are thinking about how they want to live with one another, and therefore that's reflected in the codes and the zoning and how that's done. And you having seen that evolution and being a part of it, and how we live now has been how we live in these patterns is done through the planning process and very careful consideration of how that will look and how that will affect people's lives, how they lead their lives in the places where they live and work in
Yep.
Fitchburg.
Yeah. One thing I could add to that is times have changed. People aren't having children like they used to, young families. Birth rates are down, and that we have a whole different makeup of households. But a number of people still want single family housing. They just don't want it in a standard single family subdivision. I remember getting calls from people because they liked the idea of the smart code because it could be at a small house in a small lot because they were single or there was just two of them and they didn't want to be having to be a big lot to take care of, mow or you get the lawn taken care of and stuff like that. They wanted those small properties. So we tend to think a lot about where we came from, the large lot, single families, but there are a number of people that don't live that way. So it kind of adds what I was saying into that whole socio and economic and kind of even demographic diversity.
Absolutely. And the planning has reflected that and the connectivity among people too, and how that can be done through walking and bicycling besides our tendency to think in terms of automobiles too, our types of transportation, all of that, so much complexity to it. Well, Tom, I'd like to ask you, the city of Fitchburg, of course, is unique in many ways. But particularly, it's the only municipality to have both the smart code zoning that you've been describing to us, and then the exclusive agricultural zoning. So what led to that unique structure that we have in Fitchburg?
I think you could say that the uniqueness of Fitchburg is that it's a town converting to an urban area or suburban and urban area. And what Fitchburg began as a rural community, it transitioned to a rural and suburban community, and is now transitioning to a rural, suburban, and also to a mixed use community. And, interestingly, people typically have always identified Fitchburg more by their subdivision than by the city in which they are located. I think that's still true today, but the whole idea of the smart code is to try to create that sense of place within, kind of putting you there and saying, oh, yeah, I'm in Fitchburg, and not say, oh, I'm a resident of Seminole Hills or I'm a resident of Seminole Forest, that you are a resident of Fitchburg. So that transitioning to mixed use developments is exemplified by the plans and by our smart code zoning. It could be done under standard zoning, but it'd be more difficult to do that kind of thing. But we have a real mix of community types, rural, suburban, and mixed use. The city plans and smart code implement that walkable, trans-friendly option. And that diversity of mixed use in the code strengthens the community. And at times, diversity can pose a challenge, but in the long run, making room for a variety of lifestyles helps enhance the community. So in Fitchburg history, its rural nature has brought about both of these zoning districts. So exclusive ag zoning came into place in the late 1970s. Even before we were a city, it was seen by the state as important. And so they put this in, and then farmers, we talked about this, I think, in some of the prior episodes, rural landowners could get some tax credit based on being in a exclusive ag zoning and having a farmland preservation plan. So that was one method to help preserve farmland, was the exclusive ag zoning. The other method is we knew we were developing. And so how can you develop better to help preserve farmland? Well, that's to have an appropriate level of density. And we talked about, excuse me, how in some of the charrettes that we had, the housing charrette, people saw if you develop a low density, how much of the city would be gobbled up. They didn't like that. So there was that desire to move to a more somewhat higher, but yet appropriate density for the community. And so that's what's, can be done through the smart code. And then, as I mentioned, it kind of allows some flexibility with the development. So it helps provide for that reasonable density, which helps protect the agricultural land. So kind of both work together. If we're going to develop, you develop in a smart way, so you're not gobbling up as much farmland as you otherwise would. So, experience in Fitchburg that I've had shows that the most contentious issues are present at or near the borders of the different landscape types. And it could be the rural development to urban, or rural to suburban, or it can be the differences between single family and non-single family development if they're too close to each other. But that's why we plan and implement the plans, because we can help mitigate those conflicts. So that's the intent of those two codes, to help mitigate the conflicts and to kind of set those boundaries and barriers. Really is what the exclusive ag zoning does. But then the smart code comes in and says, well, we'll give you some more flexibility in development, because we want to know that we can develop at a better density to help preserve our ag land. So as I noted in my first presentation, that urban-rural divide provides Fitchburg with its unique perspective, but it also provides that sense of place to Fitchburg, that idea that when you live in Fitchburg, you're not far from the rural. So when the rural is lost, so too will Fitchburg's a good part of its sense of identity or sense of place, which has been uniquely constructed for decades around that urban-rural tension that exists and has been existing in Fitchburg for some time now. So the smart code zoning and exclusive ag are intent on preserving the values of Fitchburg, which is that pastoral heritage that it has from when it was pretty much a farming community back prior to the 50s.
Thank you, Tom. That leads into my next question, really, which is that vision of Fitchburg, and maybe asking you what your hopes and dreams are for Fitchburg. Fitchburg will be celebrating this next year in 2023, as we're almost ready to head into that new year, celebrating its 40th anniversary as a city, and identity as a city. So wondering, maybe at this juncture, and as we complete our series of interviews with you, asking you what your hopes and dreams are for Fitchburg as we move into the future.
Sure. One thing I want to comment on is that while Fitchburg has been a city for 40 years, or will be coming April of 2023, it's been a community for much longer, because it takes its base and its heritage goes way back to the mid part of the 1800s when it was first created, and the Romans set up the first homestead, so to speak, in Fitchburg, and then it started growing there and attracted a number of Irish settlers and became a farming community. And then in the kind of right after World War II, it started transitioning to a rural subdivision community, and then urban subdivisions came in. But yeah, I have a few hopes. First is to respect the diversity of land use from the rural to the varied levels we see with the built environment. Residents recognize that the city's strength is its rural area, and that it can be protected by allowing for appropriate density of development in the urban area. The city developed from a farm community to the third largest population city in the county, and it did so by recognizing not only the variety of development types, but also the importance of rural land, the city's character. Planning and its implementation are important to create that viable and livable place. Community vision and its values are expressed in a variety of ways, most importantly through the built environment. And geographer David Sack, who used to teach at the university years ago, back when I was there, once wrote, "Understanding the spatial manifestations of behavior becomes increasingly urgent as social relations continue to increase in complexity." So that built environment is interplay between the population, its values, and its social relations. And that's why planning and zoning is so important. It's a spatial construction of the community's values, is what, that helps form the community value, what we see on the ground. Second, Fitchburg needs to respect its agricultural land, for its that heritage makes up such a large part of the community's collective value, its sense of place. And so Fitchburg heritage needs to be able to be recalled other than old plat maps and old photos and reminiscent names of in subdivisions. So it's important to maintain that rural aspect. And land use diversity helps lead to diversity of socioeconomic status, which leads to a diversity in other identifiers as well. The values of the community are not always easy to discern. After all, people have different beliefs, experiences, and memories which inform their values. But as planners, the task is to take those varied values and find that common ground. The ethos and values of a place are told in its history. The values expressed in the land and the built environment will be around for a very long time. Once you're there, you're there. You can see redevelopment, as you can see, but it takes years for that to occur. And my hope is that Fitchburg residents and policymakers will recognize the importance of a variety of land uses from the rural to the urban to create a meaningful environment to meet a variety of needs and desires. And finally, the strength of the community is its residents. Yet many of those residents are here due to the unique nature of Fitchburg related to its sense of history that they may not always understand, but it's that rural nature. There's that sense that, yes, you're close to that rural. The rural area is often disregarded and only thought of as the next place for a subdivision. That attitude demeans the community and its prior residents who helped create that sense of place. So in the quest for urban and suburban expansion, rural land seems fleeting, but yet it is the true heart of the city and what makes Fitchburg unique. It would not serve Fitchburg residents well to succumb to a movement that singularly places economy over human values. And I think this is important so residents others will recognize Fitchburg as a place and that they identify as a resident of Fitchburg. So the whole series of 3 episodes has been intended to explain how and why planning was done, how it evolved, and how it is implemented in order to produce a place called Fitchburg that encourages interaction, creates neighborliness, and to allow lives to be led in a purposeful and meaningful manner. This is the purpose of plans and their implementation. The plans and the codes work together to provide the landscape on which these values can be expressed. So one last thing, Catherine, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in the interviews and able to provide this history of Fitchburg planning and zoning. And so as Fitchburg celebrates 40 years as a city this coming April, as I mentioned, it's been a community much longer. And so the history is important to understanding Fitchburg's past, its present, and I hope it'll continue to form its future. So thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Tom, for this extraordinary series of giving us insight into the development of Fitchburg and what that has entailed, the detail and the planning, the thoughtful process that's been going on all these years that you have been a part of, and have put your own passion into this work. Thank you for that. From the residents of the city of Fitchburg, our gratitude to you for this series, but most of all for those 32 years of your planning and your care for the city of Fitchburg and its values and identity. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You are so much a part of what has happened in the city of Fitchburg through these many years, and your legacy will live on. And I wanted to just mention also our website for people to check out. So much there for you to see about the history of Fitchburg and where we have been and where we're headed. And our website is fitchburghistory.org. So please feel free to check that out anytime. So thank you so much again, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome, Catherine.